Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Now, today I have a bit of a different upload for you. It is a supercut that contains all of my episodes of Horror-Thon for 2020. And I chose to do this for one simple reason, and that's because I had a lot more uploads during the month of October than I was planning on. Originally, I was just going to have the Horror-Thon episodes, and then I started TMRP. And then I was doing, other things on top of that, as you guys all saw with the Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1 discussion with the Anti-Trekker and Crazy Joe. I did that. I also did a Season 1 review of The Mandalorian. So I wanted to put all of my Horror-Thon episodes in one convenient place for those of you that don't want to dig through all of my channel uploads for the month of October. Timestamps will be provided in the description, just in case if you are only interested in like one or two of the videos. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Horror-Thon was very fun for me to do, and I hope to do it again next year. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio, and more specifically, welcome to the first episode of what I am calling the Horror-Thon. Not just for 2020, but in the history of MetrObelisk Radio. Well, a very short history, but you get my point. And for the first Horror-Thon episode, I wanted to take a look at all of the Sharknado movies, since there are 6 of them. Now, I know that these movies are made for TV horror, but they still classify as horror to me. They're shark movies, for crying out loud. If these movies don't classify as horror, then Jaws doesn't classify as horror by that logic. Then Jaws is an action movie with a shark in it. Now, these movies premiered on the Sci-Fi Network in July of 2013, and they made one every year until 2018. Now, it's not a stretch to say that these movies made a ton of money to warrant 6 of them, but are these movies any good? Are they worth your time? Do these movies try to be like Jaws, or do they try to be like Piranha? Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, Metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute Library, or whatever platform you are currently watching this on. And with that out of the way, let's get right into the Sharknado series. So as always, we're going to start off with the creative team of all these movies. Now, all of these movies were directed by Anthony C. Ferrante. Now, he's directed a lot of movies that have either been direct-to-cable or direct-to-video. Those movies include Boo, Zombie Tidal Wave, Forgotten Evil, and the Hansel and Gretel. That was a straight-to-video modern retelling of the classic horror tale, and that released in 2013. Then we have the writers, and there's 2 writers in this series. You have Thunder Levin. Now, he only wrote the first 4 movies, even though he's actually credited for writing all 6. Now, his other writing credits include Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood, AE Apocalypse Earth, Geo Disaster, and Megalodon, all straight-to-video / straight-to-cable horror. Then we have Scotty Mullen, and he only wrote Sharknadoes 5 and 6. Now, his other writing credits include Zombies. Yes, there is a horror movie called Zombies, look it up. And along with the sequel to Zombies, Zombies 2, Nazi Overlord, and The Co-Ed and the Zombie Stoner. Now, all these movies were produced by David Michael Latt. Now, he's produced a lot of direct-to-video and direct-to-cable movies that include Super Croc, King of the Lost World, which is basically just a King Kong ripoff, Jane White is Sick and Twisted, and Mega Shark vs. Giant Octopus. Now, to close this section off, none of these guys are really here to write or produce The Godfather or The Shining. Their goal is really to make a bunch of midnight movies, and that's what they've done. And don't discredit the guys that are making a lot of B movies, because a lot of people like Roger Corman and Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, have basically made their careers off of B movies. Now let's move on to the actor-character analysis portion of this, and I'm going to focus on doing an actor-character analysis of all 6 movies, and there's only 3 characters that you're really going to care about during this series. So we'll start off with the lead, and that's Ian Ziering as Finn Shepard. Now, he's the main character throughout this series, as I just stated. Now, he's the guy who stops all the Sharknadoes in all 6 movies. Now, if the name Ian Ziering rings a bell, then that's because it should. Most people know him from Beverly Hills 90210 when he played Steve Sanders, and he was one of only 4 actors to be in every episode of 90210, and that show ran for a total of 292 episodes. Now, he would move on to do other things like voice Harry Osborn in the Spider-Man new animated series, that was on MTV back in '03. And also, for any Godzilla fans, he provided the voice of Dr. Nico Tatopoulos, and I'm sorry, I have not seen Godzilla, because that series followed the 1998 movie with Matthew Broderick. I've yet to see it. Then we have Tara Reid as April Wexler. Now, April is the quote-unquote wife of Finn Shepard. They were separated in the first movie, but then got back together in the sequels. In the second movie, she loses her hand, and that's what leads her to get a modified buzzsaw so she can kill the sharks. She then becomes fully robotic because she gets quote-unquote killed off in Sharknado 3. And with this character, yeah, she started normal, but got more and more robotic as the series went on. Now, most of you listening to this know Tara Reid as Vicky from American Pie, hopefully. Now, she did other movies such as The Big Lebowski as Bunny Lebowski. She did Van Wilder with Ryan Reynolds back in the day, and Urban Legend with Jared Leto. And the last character we're going to touch on is Cassie Serbo as Nova Clark. Now, she only appears in four of the 6 movies. Now, even though she was only in 4 of the movies, she's actually important to the series. She starts off as just a waitress at Finn's Bar on the Santa Monica Pier, and then becomes a full-on warrior hell-bent on killing all of the sharks for killing her grandfather years and years prior. The only Sharknado movies that Nova are not in are Sharknadoes 2 and 4, and technically she's in the last 20 to 30 seconds of Sharknado 4, but we don't count that. Now the big thing that Cassie Serbo is known for was being Lauren Tanner in the ABC Family series Make It or Break It, and that was the show that followed the gymnasts that had hopes of making it to the Olympics one day. She's also been in Bring It On, In It to Win It. That was one of the straight-to-video sequels for Bring It On, and I've personally never seen any of the Bring It On movies, so whatever. Agoraphobia, My Life as a Dead Girl, and she was supposed to star as Captain Kirk's granddaughter in Star Trek Progeny. Now, Star Trek Progeny being a Star Trek fan film that the fan film guidelines destroyed and was later released as an animated short. And if you're curious to know about the Star Trek fan film guidelines, I brought them up in my Star Trek Beyond retrospective, and it's probably up on the platform that you're currently watching this on. I'll put a link to that in the description of this episode below. Now let's actually jump into the movies in this series, and we're going to start off with the very first movie, which is just Sharknado. Now, the movie is basically about these cyclone/water tornadoes being started by a hurricane that's pushing all of these sharks up onto land that are killing everyone that they come into contact with. Now, this being the first movie in the franchise means that not all of the kinks are going to be worked out right away. I feel that this movie takes itself too seriously at times given its premise. The premise being that it's Jaws meets Twister. Now, this isn't The Godfather or Goodfellas or The Shining or insert X movie here. You know, it should be a movie that sells itself on the ridiculousness of the premise, but I feel that the movie holds itself back intentionally. Now, the story at the heart of the movie is a surfer who owns a bar, has to rescue his family from these Sharknadoes that are popping up all over LA. Oh no! Sharknadoes killing everyone in Los Angeles! Now, the movie does highlight the ridiculousness by the end where Finn's son flies up in the helicopter with Nova to drop bombs in the middle of these tornadoes to cancel themselves out. Now, Nova gets eaten by a shark, but somehow lives because she was swallowed whole. Then Finn gets eaten by the same shark, but cuts through him with a chainsaw. Now, to close off this movie, because there really wasn't much to it, I feel that the filmmakers didn't really embrace the ridiculousness of the premise, and I feel that the first movie really suffered as a result. Now, like I said, this movie is basically Jaws meets Twister, and this should have felt more like Piranha. Now, either the Joe Dante movie or the Alexander Aja movie that came out in 2010. And one thing that I forgot about, one really stupid line in this movie that never escapes me, is when they're about to go on the 405. And there's a bunch of traffic on the what's that called? On the freeway ramp. And you have one guy going there, "Come on, man, you live in California, why are you scared of a little rain?" Says the guy living in a city that rains maybe 10 days out of the year. Now let's move on to Sharknado 2, the second one. And yes, it is called that, Sharknado 2, the second one. Now, this movie, instead of taking place in LA, it takes place in New York. Now, since the first movie, April has written a book that is called How to Survive a Sharknado. And they're going to New York for a book tour, but another Sharknado basically threatens that. Now, this movie plays into the more ridiculous nature of the first one, and in this movie, they show shows like Michael and Kelly, that was previously Regis and Kelly, as well as the Today Show with Matt Lauer and Al Roker. And this is more shown with the Today Show segments where they're talking about the Sharknadoes and have actual graphics depicting where the sharks will fall, and also how fast they'll be falling from out of the sky. Try saying that 3 times fast. And the sharks are going to be coming down at 2 inches per hour. So you better get your umbrellas ready and stay indoors. Back to you, Matt. Thanks, whoever I'm blowing under my desk. Oh, what? Sorry, that's a few years too early for that one. This movie came out in 2014. Now, even though this movie is basically the same as the first one in the sense that it's about Finn needing to save his family, in this case, it's his sister and her husband with their 2 kids. Now, there is a different resolution to beating the Sharknado in this movie, at least. You know, in the first movie, they built bombs to throw into the Sharknado to cancel them out. In this movie, not only does building the bombs not work, it actually makes the situation worse, where now sharks are raining from the sky in a fiery hailstorm. Now, in order to beat the Sharknado now in this movie, Finn has to go to the top of the Empire State Building and freeze the tornado using the Freon tanks. And for those of you who don't know, Freon is what's running in your air conditioner. And the Empire State Building is used as a lightning rod to ignite it into the air to freeze out the Sharknado. And as I just stated, this movie does get more ridiculous than the first one. In the beginning, April loses her hand and gets it replaced with a modified buzzsaw so she can cut through the sharks. Now, if there was a time to really go for it in terms of ridiculousness, it was now. I understand that the first movie had problems with taking itself too seriously at times, but I attribute that problem to being the first movie. It's like the pilot of a TV show. Yeah, the first episode of this TV show had a lot of problems, but again, it's a pilot episode. What are you expecting? You know, if Sharknado hadn't gotten more ridiculous by now, then its charm would have worn off this early, and we wouldn't be talking about another 4 movies beyond this one. Aw, oh, hell no. Now we gotta move on to Sharknado 3, which is conveniently titled Shark 3. Oh, hell no. Now, this movie takes the ridiculousness of the first 2 movies and just cranks it up to 11. In this movie, there are a bunch of Sharknadoes that are appearing all up and down all over the East Coast. If Finn doesn't stop these in time, then the entire East Coast gets wiped out. Boo-hoo-hoo. Cry me a river. To show how ridiculous it is, this movie has a James Bond type of intro at first, with the shark mouth acting as the sniper scope and having Finn jump through it with a chainsaw. And also in this movie, April is pregnant with Finn's son. Now, how is this movie more ridiculous than the first 2? First, Mark Cuban is the president in this movie. Yes, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks and one of the hosts on Shark Tank, and his vice president is none other than Ann Coulter, and I am not going into my personal opinions on that because I am vowed to piss at least half of you off. Then David Hasselhoff comes in as Finn's father, and yes, they have to go to space in order to stop the Sharknadoes. Now, they do eventually stop the Sharknadoes, and that causes the sharks to start launching themselves into space. And this is the moment where I feel the filmmakers became very self-aware because the sharks are surviving in space. Now, how are the sharks surviving in space? Well, how have they been surviving up in the clouds for so long? Who knows, and really, who cares? Now, how did Finn and April get back down to Earth, you might ask? Was it in the shuttle that they went up in and, ground control to Major Tom? Well, not exactly. They both get swallowed by the big shark and then went crashing into the atmosphere, burning the shark up, and then Finn launched a couple of parachutes, and they landed safely right down on a nice little beachhead. Now, this is the first movie to actually end on a cliffhanger. At the end, April and Finn's son is born. April goes to retrieve the wings that David Hasselhoff's character gives them, and you see a piece of the shuttle basically come for her. Now, did the piece of the shuttle hit her, or does she walk away? Stay tuned for the next installment of Now, there was only one way for the series to go further if it wanted to remain relevant, and that was to get more ridiculous than even the second movie did. The second movie took itself seriously as well, but not to the extent that the first movie did. This one just throws the baby out with the bathwater and doesn't take itself seriously at all. But it works given how ridiculous the original premise is, which is Jaws meets Twister. And they even acknowledge that connection in the movie. When Finn's daughter's in Universal Studios Orlando, she walks by the Jaws shark before she goes on the Twister roller coaster. And that was a very nice nod, what you would also call a fourth wall break to the audience that, yeah, this is all our movies are. And to close off this section, oh, hell no. Now let's talk about Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens. Now, this movie has a Star Wars type opening with a black screen and Sci-Fi Presents in the blue letters and the 4 dots. And then it cuts to the stars with the big Sharknado in yellow pulling back. And yes, it even has an opening crawl. Given that this title is very similar to Star Wars The Force Awakens, this really didn't shock me, but it did make me laugh at it for a bit. Now, this movie makes it known that there hasn't been a Sharknado in 5 years, so basically, we are 5 years removed from Sharknado 3. As always, there's a Sharknado that forms in Vegas out of sand. There's a company in this movie called Astro X that's developed a technology that can handle the Sharknadoes, but they can't beat the Sharknadoes in this movie because the Sharknadoes in this movie aren't water-based, they're more sand-based here. And we see different Sharknadoes throughout this movie, probably just to give it that edge over the other movies in the franchise. We see the Boulder-nado, and that's the one that's formed out of the sand and the rocks get into the sharks. We see an Oil-nado that forms into a Fire-nado, which, I don't feel I have to explain that jump in logic, but there is a huge problem with that logic of, the Oil-nado becoming the Fire-nado. The Fire-nado would cancel itself out once all the oil is burned up. So if there's nothing for that fire to latch onto, it's going to die anyway. Then we see an Electro-nado, a Nuke-nado, and a Cow-nado of all things. Now, the amount of different tornadoes gets ridiculous, but I get what it's here for. It's really to add to the ridiculousness of these movies. Now, in keeping with the ridiculousness, we do see the return of David Hasselhoff, and we also see Gilbert Gottfried as the Storm Chaser for the Today Show that's reporting on all these, ex-NATOs that I don't want to repeat the names of. Gary Busey's also in here. He was the head scientist who we later find out is April's father, and he brought her back to life with the robotics. Dog the Bounty Hunter even makes an appearance in this one as Chop Top, who owns a chainsaw store, and we even see an appearance from Carrot Top as a limo driver, but sadly no props are used. How sad for Carrot Top. Now, the problem with having a franchise that is always upping the ante is at some point you're going to run out of places to go. I think we've now seen all of the possible NATOs that we can see, and we've already been to Los Angeles, we've been to New York, we've been to DC and Orlando, and we start this movie in Kansas, go to Vegas, and then end at Niagara Falls. It's time to take these movies out of the United States. And that's how we get to our next entry in this series, Sharknado 5, Global Swarming. Global what? If you can tell me what that's from, then you're awesome. Now, this movie opens with titles and a set piece from Indiana Jones. Yes, it's getting more and more funny. It started with Sharknado 3. We had a James Bond opener instead of just plain text. Then in Sharknado 4, we had a Star Wars type opening and a lot of Star Wars references throughout the movie. Great, kid. Don't get cocky. So where do we go from here in terms of the opening? I don't want to predict because if I'm wrong, I'm just going to disappoint myself. Now, in this movie, they start off in London. Finn and Nova discover a druid artifact that they used to fight the Sharknadoes when they came during their time. And before anyone asks, yes, the druids were real. A druid was a member of a high-ranking class in Celtic culture. And the earliest that we know about them dates all the way back to the 4th century BCE. And the Druids, from what I've read on them, were responsible for organizing the worship services and sacrifices, and they also had the power to essentially excommunicado people from religious festivals, essentially making them the social pariahs, social outcasts of the time. Now, the cave paintings that were seen in the beginning of this movie, along with the shark fin idol, plays into the religious side of the Druids. Now, the beginning of the movie in the cave with Finn and Nova basically plays out like Raiders of the Lost Ark, when Indy and Satipo retrieve that golden idol. The only difference here is instead of a boulder chasing them out of the entrance, it's a flood with a bunch of sharks. Now, removing the idol in this movie basically causes a Sharknado to form. So unlike in the previous 4 movies where they were started by nature, Finn and Nova actually started this one, which is rather interesting to have a man-made Sharknado versus a nature-made. Now, Finn and April's son, Gil, gets sucked up into the Sharknado. And in this movie, Finn only cares about pulling Gil out of the Sharknado, whereas Nova's wanting to stop all the Sharknados for good. Now, in this Sharknado, there is a vortex that can transport Finn and April to different countries around the world as they're trying to get Gil out. Gil doesn't get pulled from the Sharknado, but Finn and April get transported to Egypt and a bunch of other countries along the way. Now, there they find a machine that the ancient Egyptians used to quell the Sharknados. Now, Finn and April inadvertently caused the apocalypse by this point. April dies because she uses all of her energy to stop the Sharknados worldwide for good, and all of Finn's family dies along with everyone on the face of the earth, leaving Finn to essentially become that lone wanderer. Now, that is until an older Gil comes back in a time machine to rescue his dad. Now, it's explained that Gil simply traveled through time, after the Sharknado basically collapsed, and he perfected the time travel by harnessing the vortex using a what? A flux capacitor. Now, the movie ends the same way as Back to the Future with the whole, where we're going, we don't need roads. I'm not humming any further because fuck you, MG. And it also has the title card from the end of Back to the Future Part 2 with the "To Be Continued." Now, I can't omit this from the Sharknado 5 section. Gilbert Gottfried is back as the Ron McDonald weatherman on the ground. He's in Africa reporting on a Sharknado there. Well, you see here, there are gazelles and now lions getting sucked up into there. Now the sharks are chasing the lions who are chasing the gazelles. It's a safari-nado! Yeah, I can't do Gilbert Gottfried at all, so pardon me. I'm like Trey Parker and Matt Stone on South Park, where our impressions on this show are done very, very horribly, intentionally. Just ignore the fact that I can't do impressions to save my life. Gilbert Gottfried, you're here to add to the ridiculousness of the movies. Look at how far he has come from just being the guy in the upper right square on the game show Hollywood Squares. Now it's about time that we get to the last Sharknado. So let's look at the last Sharknado. It's about time. Now this movie doesn't have any stylized opening like a James Bond opener or Star Wars or Indiana Jones. Instead, this movie just picks up immediately where Sharknado 5 left off, and this movie gets straight into the action, and that's a good thing, given that this movie is the conclusion to the series. Now, the title for this movie is what I would call a double entendre. On one hand, the title is self-aware in the sense that we're finally on the last of these terrible movies. Thank God. Now, also, the premise of this movie is in the title, It's About Time. Basically spelling out that this movie is centered around time travel, if you remember the ending of Sharknado 5. Now, the time travel in this movie takes its logic from Back to the Future, that time is not linear. In fact, you can create alternate timelines if you go into the past and change certain things. And there are even quite a few nods to the Back of the Future series. Back to the Future series, not Back of the Future. Back to the Future. Now, one of the things is the pocket-sized flux capacitor. Another thing is Finn and the other characters having to travel at speeds of 88 miles an hour in order to go through the time vortex. Now, this movie goes everywhere from the Age of the Dinosaurs to medieval Europe to the American Revolution to the Old West to a future that's ruled by the robotic Aprils. Now, during this time travel, it does bring some character arcs full circle, and the biggest one is Nova. She originally leaves a letter for her grandfather back in the American Revolution days, but Finn tears it up, It's later discovered and taped together as she sees it when she tried to stop her grandfather from dying. Now she learns that's where she gets her name from, is that very letter. Now what she learns after this is she was supposed to be the one who crashed the boat, only this time the younger version of herself and her grandfather made it out alive, whereas she personally didn't. Now this leads into killing these characters off for good. Gil brought these characters back to help Finn, but they all pretty much ended up getting killed, including Finn himself. Now, the very end of this movie goes back to the first Sharknado that we see at the beginning of the first movie, and he ends up dying to prevent the first Sharknado movie from essentially ever happening. Now, what this did is it prevented creating the time paradox. The new versions of Finn, April, Nova, and his kids would have never known what happened with the Sharknados, because this isn't a new timeline where they never broke out. Finn doesn't become the hero that saved everyone from these Sharknados, and he's just a family man and bar owner. Now, before I close this off, I can't leave out Gilbert Gottfried. He comes back when they travel back to Santa Monica in the 60s on the newscast in front of the camera. He called the Sharknado a Shark and Roll-nado, given that a rock band was playing on that beach just prior to the Sharknado breaking out, and it was, everybody do the shark, da, 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 da. Yeah, whatever bullshit that was. It was obviously a parody. I believe it was a parody of a song called Let's Go to the Hop. It came out in the late 50s, early 60s, and that's the closest that song sounded to me, at least. Now let's look at how this movie series was received. Now, as you can imagine, all of these movies did not receive the highest critical or audience scores of the like. Now, the first movie actually got the highest Rotten Tomatoes score of 78% for some reason, and the lowest scoring Rotten Tomatoes score is Sharknado 4 at 14%. And if we take all the percentages of each installment on Rotten Tomatoes, we get an average Rotten Tomatoes score of 41%, right on the nose. Now, it's not great, but it's not terrible for the series. And likewise, if we look at IMDb, the highest IMDb score goes to Sharknado 3 at 4.1 out of 10, and the lowest scoring movie in the series goes to the first movie at a 3.3 out of 10. And if we take all these movie scores and average them, we get an average IMDb score of 3.8 out of 10 for the entire series. Now, I can't look into how much each movie made, because these were not released theatrically. They were released on the Sci-Fi Network, so Comcast doesn't have to report to the public how much each of these movies grossed, how much they made in syndication. Now, they obviously made enough money to warrant 6 of them. But I did find the reported budgets for these movies. Now, the cheapest movie to make was the first one at anywhere from, $1.5 to $2 million. And the last one was the most expensive budget at a grand total of $5 million. Now, not only were they making a lot of money for the Sci-Fi Network and Comcast, they were insanely fucking cheap to produce in terms of making movies. Look, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. These movies are B-movie schlock that you would watch as a midnight horror movie. Are these movies trying to be anything else, though? No, not really. The filmmakers knew that these movies would basically be like the midnight horror movies that you watch and don't take seriously at all. Now, the movies got more science fiction-y by the end, but that was only for the last Sharknado, and they had to end the series somehow and make it so there couldn't be a number 7. And what was the best way to end a series that was getting so ridiculous and crazy? Number 1, return to normal, and if you couldn't simply return to normal, then number 2, create an alternate timeline where the first Sharknado movie never happened, and they did the latter. Now, and I'll end this episode off with this. These movies aren't terrible for what they are, but I do feel that them being made for TV really held them back in terms of blood and gore. Now, these are horror movies based around sharks and people either getting crushed by them or eaten by them. In fact, one of the best running gags in the series is Finn always getting eaten by a shark in every movie and living to tell the tale. Now, with people getting eaten by sharks that are coming from the sky, I was expecting a little more in the blood and gore department. That way the movie can feel more like Piranha rather than the edited for television version of Piranha. Now, if you were to ask me which of these movies are the best of the bunch, I would personally say Sharknado's 3, 4, and 5. Just because those movies took the ridiculous nature of the premise and cranked it all the way up to 11. Sharknado 1 took itself a little too seriously in all of the wrong places, and Sharknado 2 frankly wasn't that much better. The Sharknado, not terrible. I can personally see why the series needed to end the way it ended. The problem with Sharknado 1, 2, and the last Sharknado is I feel there's no rewatchability like you had in, Sharknadoes 3, 4, and 5. Now, Sharknado 4 and 5 at least had Gilbert Gottfried in there to really add to the ridiculousness of the premise of a tornado filled with sharks. And he was also in Sharknado 6, but for a very, very brief amount of time. Now, watch these movies if you're curious. Keep in mind, you're not getting Jaws here, and you're not even getting Piranha, really. You're getting the edited for television version of Piranha. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. For today's Horror-thon episode, we are taking a look at Dagon. Now, I felt that I needed to look at this movie with it being based off of H.P. Lovecraft, one of the masters of the macabre. Now, I personally have never seen anyone talk about this movie, and I didn't even know about its existence until I found this on DVD at a local pawn shop for less than $1 about a year prior to recording this episode. So, I guess the only question on the table is this movie any good? And also, with Lovecraft being known to really scare the shit out of you with his writing alone, does that translate to the screen very well, or does it just completely fall flat? Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, MetrObeliskRadio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute, Library, or whatever other platform you're currently watching this on. So with that out of the way, let's get right into Dagon. Now, as always, we start off with the creative team, and now this movie was directed by Stuart Gordon. Now, most of you listening to this might know him as the director of the cult classic horror movie Reanimator, and he's directed other movies like Dolls, The Pin, the Pendulum, and with Lance Henriksen, Fortress with Christopher Lambert, and Space Truckers. Now, this movie was written by Dennis Paoli, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name. He's written movies such as Reanimator, Ghoulies 2, The Pin, the Pendulum, Body Snatchers, and The Dentist. Now, this movie was actually based off of 2 Lovecraft stories, and I decided to make this part its own section so I could really talk about what each story is and what each story contains. So we're going to start off by looking at the story titled Dagon, where the movie gets its title from. Now, this was a short story originally written in 1917, and this would be Lovecraft's first story that he wrote as an adult. And it would be first published in The Vagrant. That was a magazine in the late 19-teens going into the 20s. Now, the story is that of a morphine-addicted man relating a story that happened to him while he was an officer during World War I. His cargo ship was captured by the Imperial Germans. He escapes on a lifeboat and drifts aimlessly until he gets just south of the equator. There he washes up on some godforsaken place, and once he's there, he sees monoliths of worship in various hieroglyphs. And that's when the sea creatures, start revealing themselves, and they went to worship said monoliths. Now, the story ends with the man waking up in a San Francisco hospital, knowing that no one would ever believe his story. Now, the story also lays some of the groundwork for future work, such as his Cthulhu mythos with the sea Dagon, that's the sea creature. Now, the sea creature has been referred to as the sea-delayed Dagon, but Lovecraft never actually gave that sea creature a name in the story. That was only the readers that applied the name Dagon to it. And now we're going to get into the second story, which this movie is actually more loosely based off of, and that's The Shadow over Innsmouth. Now, this was a novella that was written in 1931, and it was the only Lovecraft story to be published in book form during his lifetime. And I believe that the first printing of the novella was published in 1936. So the book follows a guy who's going back to the town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, after a secret government investigation ruined the town. He's relating the story of how he led said investigation that destroyed the town. Now, Innsmouth in this story is a deserted fishing town that's been taken over by these fish-like humanoids called the Deep Ones. When hard times fell on the town, a cult called the Esoteric Order of Dagon was established. The locals offered human sacrifices to the Deep Ones in exchange for wealth in the form of large fish hauls and jewelry. But when the townspeople arrested the cult leader along with his followers, the Deep Ones attacked the town and killed half their population right off the bat. After this, the townspeople had to agree to the cult's practices, and they had to start breeding with the Deep Ones. Now, the children would be born as normal human beings, but then slowly transformed into one of the Deep Ones. Now, by the end of the story, we find out that the narrator is the descendant of the cult leader, and he is transforming into one of these Deep Ones. Now, accepting his fate, he breaks his cousin out of an asylum, and they go live in the Deep One city beneath the sea together. Now, the Deep Ones are the same creatures that were in Dagon that were worshipping the monolith. It wasn't until this novella that they were officially given a name by Lovecraft. Now let's move on to the character analysis portion of this movie, and we're going to start off with the main character, and that is Ezra Godin as Paul. Now, he's a guy who runs a successful company that gets stranded in a fishing town in Spain after his boat basically runs aground and crashes into a bunch of rocks. Now, pretty soon, the townspeople are chasing him, and all he wants to do is find Barbara. Now, he finds out that she's quote-unquote dead, so now he just wants to escape the town alive, and that's really it. And he's also having these dreams or nightmares of another woman pulling him to the bottom of the ocean. Then we have Raquel Morano as Barbara. Now, she's the love interest for Paul in this movie. Now, in the beginning, when their ship crashed in the ocean by getting, caught on some rocks and slammed into them, she stayed back on land to call the cops while Paul went to save the other people on the boat. Now, she gets kidnapped, and we don't see her again until, the third act of the movie. Now, she tries to escape with Paul at one point, but she gets caught and is made a sacrifice to Dagon. Dagon would put a child inside of her. She would die, but the child would live forever. Then we have Francisco Rabal as Ezekiel. Now, he's the old man who's just here in the movie to give the exposition-heavy backstory about the town, how the fishing village was experiencing hard times because the fish stopped coming in. A cult leader came in and promised the town all the fish and jewelry in the world, but human sacrifices had to be made to Dagon to keep the fish coming in. Now, at some point in the town, they were running out of people to sacrifice, so they were just waiting for passerbys to stop into town or to crash. And finally, we have Macarena Gomez as Uchia, and she was more of the priestess. She's the woman that Paul was having all of those dreams or nightmares about, however you want to define them. Now, I can't remember if she was a princess or a priestess, but she does act more like a priestess at the end of the movie when she offers Barbara as a sacrifice to Dagon. Now, she has become one of the Deep Ones who can live on land, but has to travel in a wheelchair because her legs have been transformed basically into tentacles. Now let's move on to talk about the narrative of the movie. And like I said, this movie narratively is a loose adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth. The only thing that's really taken from the original Dagon short story is the name of the sea creature that is worshipped in the movie. Lovecraft never gave a name to the sea creature being worshipped in the original short story, as I said, but I feel I need to reiterate that it was the readers that gave him the name Dagon. Now, getting back to the movie, there are some deviations from The Shadow of Innsmouth, and I want to get into those. So first off, this movie is modernized for the early 2000s. Keep in mind that The Shadow over Innsmouth was written in 1931 and published in 1936. This movie would come out in 2001 in Spain and 2002 for the rest of the world. So we're looking at a time span of about 65 to 70 years from when the original source material was written. You're going to see the use of laptop computers and very early cell phones, but not those brick cell phones that came out in the 80s, where there were, at the time where there were only 2 cell towers in the entire United States alone. But the cell phones are definitely pre-smartphone. Now, this being a horror movie, none of the phones work for obvious reasons, and that goes for both cellular and landline, because if the phones worked, then you don't have a horror movie. There's also a change to the main character as well. Instead of Paul being a government agent investigating the fishing town that would inevitably, be destroyed by the investigation, he's a multimillionaire who happened to be vacationing in the area. And the character of Ezekiel is there to fill the role of Zadok. That was in the original novella. Zadok was the guy that gave the exposition-heavy backstory of here's how the cult came in and saved the town and then fucked us all in the ass later. Now, Barbara and Uchia are additions for this movie particularly, just to give it some deviation. Now, here's the biggest deviation that most people are probably going to recognize. The movie doesn't take place in Massachusetts at all. It takes place in Spain. Now, in my opinion, I believe that this has everything to do with the fact that this movie was produced by production companies headquartered in Spain. Now, this is something that isn't unique to just Dagon. This exact thing happened with War of the Worlds, believe it or not. The original book that was published back in 1898 took place in Woking, Surrey, England, and the surrounding areas of Surrey, England. Then when Orson Welles adapted it, when he adapted it for his now famous radio drama of the same name, he had the location changed to Grover's Mill, New Jersey. And then when the original movie came out in '53, the location was changed again from Grover's Mill, New Jersey to Southern California. And finally, with the 2005 movie, that was with Tom Cruise and Dakota Fanning, it starts in Brooklyn, and then it goes to New Jersey. It doesn't even go to Grover's Mill. And then once the, storm hits and then the aliens start coming in, the rest of the movie is about Tom Cruise and Dakota Fanning getting from New Jersey to Boston. Now, the ending of this movie deviates quite significantly from the original novella, that's The Shadow over Innsmouth. In the novella, the main character accepts his fate that he is a deep one. What he does after that is to go break his cousin out of the mental institution, and then they both go live in the Deep One city that's beneath the ocean. In this movie, Paul tries to commit suicide by pouring gasoline on himself and lighting a match. Uchiha saves him by pulling him into the water, and then he follows her down through a gate, which I assume leads to the Deep One city. The city itself is actually not shown in the movie. However, it does end with a quote from The Shadow over Innsmouth, and one I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. Now, as I was recording this episode, I actually went and found that closing quote from Lovecraft. It's actually a paraphrasing of the very last line of The Shadow over Innsmouth. And the movie's closing quote is, "We shall swim out to the brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses to Cyclopean and many-columned Yaha-Nethle." I know I probably butchered that word, but, it's Lovecraft. But to continue with the quote, "And in the lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever." So now I want to look into how this movie was received. Now this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 69%, and that was based on 13 critic reviews, and an audience score of 56% based on 7,593 audience reviews. And this movie sits on IMDb at 6.2 out of 10, and that's based on 16,496 reviews. Now, at the time of this recording, I cannot find this movie on Metacritic for the life of me. If any of you listening to this happens to find that score on Metacritic, please leave it down below in the comments, as I am genuinely curious what it is. Now, this movie was made on a budget of 4.2 million euros. Now, that translates to roughly 4,955,290 current US dollars in 2020. Now, this movie only grossed $145,046 worldwide. Now, it is safe to say that this movie was not a financial hit at the box office. And looking further into this movie was not released theatrically in the United States at all. The only country that the movie was released in theatrically was in Spain. Now, the rest of the world would have to see this on home video after it had released theatrically in Spain. Now, critics at the time of this movie came out were very lukewarm. Some praised it for being very faithful to the original source material. Now, others were having problems with its third act, which I can personally see. It does kind of drag on a bit. But some also praised this as being one of, if not the best Lovecraft adaptations ever put to the silver screen. Now, I really didn't think that I would enjoy this movie as much as I did, given that I've read very little from Lovecraft. Growing up in a religious household, I wasn't allowed to get into horror. I wasn't allowed to get into horror, not hoarder, because that's Satan's way of trying to question your faith. Blah, bitty, blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm going to say this is my hot take here since I brought this up. I typically don't discuss religion, but if you're a Christian and you feel that horror movies will make you question your faith, then your faith wasn't as strong to begin with if you're going to allow some jackass like me or some jackass like Stuart Gordon basically question whether or not you think your deity is real. So to get back to the movie, because I don't want to drag on this topic for forever, I genuinely enjoyed it, and yes, it even scared the shit out of me in a couple of spots. And no, it wasn't because of the jump scares. There's only one or two moments like that where I call it a jump scare, but everything else, the horror is more natural. You know, the main character is a stranger in a strange land, and that's what truly terrifies most people, in my opinion. And to make a long story short, I'm going to end the episode off with this. If there's anything that this movie should prove, is a movie not being a financial hit at the box office isn't a judgment of quality. There are plenty of good movies out there that didn't do well in the box office, but are now viewed as classics. The one that pops to my head right now is The Shawshank Redemption. When that movie was in theaters initially, it barely broke even. It genuinely struggled to find its audience. Now, the movie wouldn't become the huge success it is now without the advent of home video. Now, and on the other side of the coin, there's also terrible movies that made a ton of money at the box office. Look at Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, or really any Fast and Furious movie beyond Tokyo Drift. Now, before I go, I genuinely want you to contemplate this. How many of your favorite movies did you discover by going to see them in the movie theater, completely blind, versus renting them from Blockbuster, Redbox, Netflix back when they were still a DVD service, or just straight up buying the DVD or Blu-ray from Walmart or Best Buy as a blind buy completely on a whim? That is a question that I cannot answer for you, but I want you to genuinely contemplate that. And who knows, you may be genuinely surprised with the answer that you come up with. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. For today's Horror-thon episode, we are taking a look at a recent slasher movie series called Hatchet. Now, this is different from Sharknado in the sense that these movies were actually independent. These movies were not made by Comcast, NBC Universal, or the Sci-Fi Network. And this series borrows heavily from the Friday the 13th franchise, and more specifically, that of the Jason Voorhees character. Now, this series is different given that there are only 4 entries in this franchise thus far, versus the 18 Friday the 13th movies. Now, I know, I'm over-exaggerating that number. The real number is actually 11. So, does Hatchet follow the trend of these slasher movie franchises where they're just endless, sequel, or does it successfully buck that trend? But before we get started, remember to follow the blog, MetrObeliskRadio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute library, or whatever platform you are currently watching this on. So with that out of the way, let's get right into the Hatchet franchise. So as always, we're going to start off with the creative team. Now, these movies were all either written or directed by Adam Green. Now, this is a guy that writes and directs his own stuff most of the time. The other movies that he's done are Frozen with Kane Hodder, not the Disney musical from 2013 of the same name. He did a segment in Chillerama called The Diary of Anne Frankenstein, a movie called Digging Up the Marrow, and Coffee and Donuts. And Coffee and Donuts was Adam Green's writing and directing debut. Now, according to Adam Green himself, he came up with the story of Hatchet when he was just 8 years old. Now, according to him, his brother showed him Friday the 13th at a very young age, and one summer, he actually went to a summer camp and was told to avoid a certain cabin, otherwise Hatchet Face would, come to get you. Now, that's where he came up with the entire backstory for what would become the killer Victor Crowley, and scared the shit out of the other kids so much that they essentially wanted to kick him out of the summer camp. Now, only one of these movies was not directed by Adam Green, and that movie would be Hatchet 3. That movie was directed by B.J. McDonnell. Now, B.J. McDonnell was a camera operator before he directed. Now, he did work on both Hatchet and Hatchet 2 as a camera operator, so at least he has a history with the series. And this would be his only feature film that he would direct. Now, he's still working as a camera operator to this day, and Adam Green, when asked why he's not directing Hatchet 3, said that he was in a position where he can give this camera operator that wants to get into directing a shot at directing a feature film, so why not? Now let's get straight into the first movie, and as always, we start off with the character analysis, and the first one we're going to look at is Joel David Moore as Ben. Now, he's the main character for this movie specifically. He's the guy who gets bored during Mardi Gras and decides to go on the Haunted Swamp tour. His buddy Marcus decides to join him. Then we have Zaragoza. I can't pronounce that name, but she's credited as Tamara Feldman, played Mary Beth. Now, the movie revolves around her after the tour boat gets stuck. Essentially, she's only in the Haunted Swamp tour to find her father and brother because it was cheaper to pay $30 to get into the swamp than it was to buy her own boat, essentially. Then we have Joel Murray as Doug Shapiro. Now, he's the sleazy guy acting like a producer to get his own private porn collection. He's filming softcore porn with basically two hot women, one blonde bimbo that, can't tell her ass from a hole in the ground, and the other who wants to be an actress. And then we get to the man himself, Kane Hodder as Victor Crowley, and Kane Hodder also played the father, Mr. Crowley. Now, Victor Crowley would be the monster for this movie. He's the slasher that runs around with the hatchet, hence the title. Now, how the story goes with him is that he was born disfigured, so his father kept him locked away, and all of the local kids kept making fun of him. And one Halloween night, a group of teenagers were throwing firecrackers through his windows to scare him, but the house caught on fire. His father comes home and tries to get the door open, but accidentally kills his son while trying to get the door down in the process. And the spirit that lurks the swamp is that of a 10 to 12-year-old Victor Crowley. Very similar to Jason from Friday the 13th after he drowned, but a completely different backstory than Jason. And then we get Robert Englund as Samson. Now, Samson would be Mary Beth's father. Now, his death is where Mary Beth's arc picks up, not just for this movie, but for the series as a whole. And I'm only bringing him up because of that. And also, you may know him from such roles such as Phantom of the Opera, the short-lived TV series V from the mid-'80s, and Wishmaster. And am I forgetting anything else? Oh yeah, he was also on that Chips show back in the day. Yeah, he was in an episode of Chips back in the early '80s. Oh, he was also in another movie called A Nightmare on Elm Street. But we can't forget about Chips. That's where everybody knows him from, is from Chips. Then we have Tony Todd as Reverend Zombie. Yes, the Candyman himself, minus his hook, unfortunately. Now, in this movie, it's more of a cameo that Tony Todd is here, but he does serve a bigger role in Hatchet 2, and I'm only bringing him up here because the foundation for his role in Hatchet 2 is laid down in this movie. And finally, we have Perry Shan as Sean, and he's the tour guide that takes our characters, with the exception of Reverend Zombie and Samson, into the swamp where Victor Crowley resides. It's learned that he's only on his second Haunted Swamp tour in this movie because his twin brother essentially gave him the job after moving down to Louisiana from Detroit. Now let's get into the narrative of Hatchet. And this movie narratively is very simple. A guy and his friend are bored with Mardi Gras, so they go do a Haunted Swamp tour in New Orleans. Now, along the Haunted Swamp tour, the boat gets caught, and they happen to be in the part of the swamp that is haunted by Victor Crowley's ghost. And all of the people are being picked off one by Victor Crowley, and all the goal really is just get out of the swamp and survive. Now, what makes this horror movie so good is the fact that there is a lot of setup. The slashing action really doesn't start happening until about 45 minutes in. Keep in mind that this movie is only about 80 to 81 minutes long. So that allows for characters to develop, so when they start getting killed, you either care about their deaths or you just openly laugh at them. And the deaths that I laughed at the hardest were that of the old guy and his wife on the tour. Speaking from personal experience, if you've ever been on a group tour, there's always that one guy that wants to just one-up everyone, including the tour guide. This is the same person when you get to the portion of the tour where the guy says something to the effect of, "You see this moss growing on these trees? Well, this is unique in the sense that the moss only grows on the north-facing side of the tree instead of the west-facing side of the tree. Does anybody want to know more?" And the one guy jumps up and goes, "I'd like to know more about the north face growing moss." And then everyone just lets out a huge groan, just, "Ah, god damn it." Yeah, everybody else groans because everybody just wants to move on, but it's that one jackass holding up the group. Now, to see those people as the first people to go in the movie, I was screaming, "Oh no, not the poor, innocent, elderly couple," while secretly laughing my ass off at the same time and clapping like a seal. Because those people had Jesus on their side. And as the one guy was getting hacked by a hatchet and the woman got her jaw ripped open, yeah, those people had Jesus. Jesus was really looking out for them. And I just pissed off all my people, all my religious followers, but fuck you, I don't care. Now, speaking of the deaths in this movie, and not just this movie, but the other movies in this series, they are very brutal. And the one that sticks out in my mind from this one is when one of the girls that was shooting softcore porn, the wannabe actress, just takes a belt sander right to the face. But that's not what kills her. Then Victor Crowley goes and decapitates basically another guy with a shovel. That was Sean. But like I said, the actress didn't die. So Victor Crowley picks her up and just impales her on the shovel. And to quote a very famous video game franchise, fatality. Now, this movie does have a very similar ending to Friday the 13th. Victor Crowley pulls Mary Beth out of the boat and into the lake. Now, the ending is different, though, because Victor Crowley uses Ben's arm to pull Mary Beth out of the water, and he and her scream at each other, and the movie just ends right then and there. Now, Hatchet is a pretty decent movie. It came out at a time when horror was really getting looked down upon commercially, and this is really the only new slasher character that's been introduced into horror over the past 15, 20 years. Now, there's probably a couple that I'm missing, but those characters are now the exception, not the rule. Nowadays in horror, we have to make Friday the 13th Part 14 or Halloween 18 instead of making new characters because money. But don't ignore Hatchet. I know that the first movie is very simple, just like Friday the 13th was, just like Halloween was, but the character of Victor Crowley would get expanded upon in the sequels. Now let's get into Hatchet 2, and we're going to start off with the characters once again. So first we have Danielle Harris as Mary Beth. Now obviously this is a recast. Danielle Harris wasn't the original Mary Beth. Now in this movie, she's just being used by Reverend Zombie to go back into the swamp to find the boat that crashed the night before since she was there. She only wants to go back into the swamp to find her father and brother's remains to give them a proper burial, and that's it. And next we have Tony Todd as Reverend Zombie. Now, like I said just a few minutes ago, he takes on a more prominent role in this movie. He wants to go into the swamp to retrieve his boat, obviously. In the first movie, he claims that he doesn't do haunted swamp tours because one guy sued him for negligence because he slipped off the boat after being a dumbass. But it's later revealed that he runs them out of another shop that he secretly owns. Now, he puts together a posse to go into the swamp and get rid of Victor Crowley because it's hurting his bottom line with tourism, and it's also hurting the hunters since they can't go into that swamp legally and hunt all of the gators, so everyone's at least got some skin in the game. Then we have Kane Hodder as Victor Crowley in this movie. Now, the mythology around this character does expand. His father was cheating on his dying wife with the nurse who was taking care of her. Victor Crowley essentially was their bastard child. Now, before Mr. Crowley's wife died, she placed a voodoo curse on him, the nurse, and the unborn bastard child. Like I said, playing into the power of voodoo. Who knew? Who knew? Who what? And I guarantee you none of you know what that's from. And when Victor Crowley was born, his mother died just by taking one look at him. And that's how he was born disfigured. Other than that, he's still the same slasher who roams the swamp with his hatchet searching for his dad. Then we have Tom Holland as Bob, and not the Tom Holland who plays Spider-Man right now. He is the quote-unquote uncle of Mary Beth that accompanies the posse into the swamp, and he's there as more of a protector when Mary Beth wants to find her father and brother and give them a proper burial. And finally, we have Perry Shen as Justin, the twin brother of Sean. If you remember just a few minutes ago, Sean said in the first movie that his twin brother got him the job of leading the haunted swamp tours. In this movie, Justin works for Reverend Zombie, and he just wants to go into the swamp to find his twin brother. Now let's get into Hatchet 2's narrative, and now this movie picks up immediately where the first movie left off. Now, they reshot some of the ending of the first movie to account for the fact that now Danielle Harris is in the role of Mary Beth instead of Tamara Feldman. Now, the same thing happened with Back to the Future Part 2. If you remember in the original in the first Back to the Future movie, Jennifer was played by Claudia Wells, who was a brunette. And in Back to the Future Part 2 and 3, Jennifer was played by Elizabeth Shue, a blonde. So, Back to the Future Part 2 opened with the ending of the first movie, really to address the recasting of Jennifer, and same in this movie, they open with the end of Hatchet to address the recasting of Mary Beth. Now, Mary Beth comes across a guy who pulls her out of the lake, and when she tells him her name, the guy tells her basically, GTFO, get the fuck out, and to find Reverend Zombie to tell her the story. She finds Reverend Zombie, and he tells her that her father was one of the 3 kids who lit the house on fire that night, the night that Victor Crowley was killed. All of the kids denied it at the time, of course. And Mary Beth wants to go back into the swamp to get the remains of her father and brother to give them a proper burial, like I said in the character analysis portion. And Reverend Zombie assembles a posse to go into the swamp as long as she brings her uncle along. Now, later what we find out is her uncle and one other character in the movie, I can't remember his name, there's too many people, were the other 2 kids who were there when the house was lit ablaze. And Reverend Zombie believed that if Victor Crowley kills the other 2 people of that group of 3, since he already killed her father, that the curse would be lifted, since his vengeance would be complete. And it's a good idea on paper, but they still don't satisfy Victor Crowley's need to find his father, and that's really the issue. Also, Bob, Mary Beth's quote-unquote uncle, wasn't the uncle who killed Crowley, it was just her father's best friend. The real uncle died of leukemia, so the idea of reversing the curse still backfires. And the deaths in this movie are just as gruesome as they were in the first one. The funniest one is a man and a woman are having sex in the swamp. Victor Crowley comes up and decapitates the man, so his body spurts out with his dinghy still in the woman. The woman then turns around and sees Victor Crowley, so she tries to run, but then takes the hatchet right in the lady's special area and then right to the chest. And that's not the funniest part. Victor Crowley actually struggled to get the hatchet back out of the woman after he stabbed her in the chest with it. Now, there's another where 2 guys get sawed with a huge chainsaw that you only see loggers like carry up in the mountains, so think like the people from Axemen. And the belt sander does come back. Now, when the belt sander came in, I was personally cheering for that because that's my favorite death in the first movie. And the movie ends with Mary Beth, quote-unquote, killing Victor Crowley by taking his hatchet and using it against him until you couldn't see his face anymore. And to top it off, she then grabs the shotgun and ends with a "fuck you" before shooting him. Now, this movie does one of the most impossible tasks as a sequel, and that's elevate the original movie. Most times, a sequel drags down the potential of the first movie in any given series, but not this one. The fact that Victor Crowley's mythology was expanded upon in this entry really helped it. And let's be honest, these movies are all about Victor Crowley. Yes, Mary Beth is in them, and she survives the first 2 movies, but a good slasher movie is going to have you cheer on for the slasher. You want the hatchet-wielding maniac to kill everyone in the movie and leave no one alive to tell the tale. You want to see the blood and guts. You want to see the gruesome deaths. You don't want to see the slasher get killed, because then there can't be any future movies with them in it, and you'll probably cry if that were to happen. Okay, that last part is just me, but still, a good slasher movie will make you cheer on for the knife-wielding maniac and not any of the people running from him. You want those bitches to fucking die. Now let's mosey on along to Hatchet 3, and we're going to obviously start with the characters like we did with the first 2 movies here. So we'll start off with Danielle Harris as Mary Beth. Now, she's used in this movie more so to kill Victor Crowley. Basically, in order to end the curse, one of the 3 kids who killed Victor Crowley has to bring Victor Crowley's father with them, and Mary Beth is a descendant of her father, who was one of the 3 kids who killed Victor Crowley. Then we have Zach Galligan as Sheriff Fowler. Now, he's the main sheriff that leads the investigation into Victor Crowley's swamp after Mary Beth comes into the police station, covered in blood, while holding a shotgun in one hand and the scalp of Victor Crowley in the other. Then we have Caroline Williams as Amanda. Now, she's the blogger, because bloggers were a thing in 2013. That's followed the Victor Crowley myth and helps Mary Beth essentially leave the jail. And she's the one that tells Mary Beth that only she can bring back Victor Crowley's father's ashes and present them to him, effectively killing the curse. And then we have Kane Hodder as Victor Crowley, and not much is really expanded upon here since he was built up in the first 2 movies. So this movie is basically just a go, go, go in terms of the killing, murder, mayhem, war, death, disease, famine, whatever you want to use. And then we get Perry Shen once again as Andrew. And this is where Perry Shen's appearances become the running gag of the series. At first, he was the tour boat driver that got decapitated in the first movie. Then he was the twin brother who took a belt sander to the back of the head in the second movie. Now, Andrew isn't even related to the first two characters. This is just here as a, oh, what, do you think we all look alike? Now, the narrative of Hatchet 3 is just like Hatchet 2. It picks up right where Hatchet 2 left off. Now, Mary Beth, quote-unquote, kills Victor Crowley at the beginning of this movie and walks into the police station with all of his blood, with the shotgun in one hand and a scalp in the other, and that leads the sheriffs to investigate all the dead bodies in the swamp, all, 20 or 30 of them. Now, while Mary Beth is sitting in the jail cell, she's visited by the blogger who wants to break the script that Victor Crowley actually exists. Nightfall comes and Victor Crowley comes back to life and starts killing all of the cops and EMTs based in that swamp, essentially. Now, the movie then turns into Mary Beth needing to take the ashes of Victor Crowley's father back to the Victor Crowley to break the curse and save all the cops. And that's the real problem with this movie, is that Victor Crowley is used more as a plot device than a character whose area has been disturbed by all of these unfortunate strangers that now just have to die because you happen to, to quote Shrek, "Get out of my swamp!" And as a result, none of the kills in this movie are really all that memorable. My favorite weapon of Victor Crowley's, which is the belt sander, does come back, but the kill with the belt sander in this movie isn't as memorable as the actress taking it to the face in the first movie and then having Justin take it to the back of the head in the second movie. No, the kill with the belt sander is, we're going to drag this guy through an open hole and then have the belt sander go through his head and then throw the body back and not even see the decapitation. So it's not even as cool. Now, the one area that I'm going to bring up is when Amanda retrieves the ashes of Victor Crowley's father. They have to go to his great uncle's house to get them. And Victor Crowley's great uncle is played by none other than Sid Haig. Now, Sid Haig has been in a lot of stuff over the years, but most of you probably remember him as Captain Spaulding from House of a Thousand Corpses and Devil's Rejects. Now, at the end, Victor Crowley is quote-unquote dead after his father's ashes get thrown on him, and Mary Beth also dies by being impaled on the tree, and she dies in quotation marks. Don't even get me started on that. Actually, I'm going to get into that in just a few moments. Actually, not even a few moments, just a few minutes. Now, this entry, while not perfect, has a good ending to the Victor Crowley myth. He got his father back, so there was no reason for him to continue his vengeance streak. There was also no reason for Mary Beth to be around any longer, since now she's served her purpose. In the first movie, she just wanted to find her father and brother. Then in the second one, she wants to get their remains and give them a proper burial. Now she has to be the one to end Victor Crowley's vengeance streak. And if the series stopped here, then I feel it would be remembered as a good trilogy of slasher movies that all play into each other. Seriously, if you watch all three movies back to back to back, with no credit sequences, this trilogy is just one large story that takes place over the course of just 3 days. But as we all know, if there's too much money in a horror franchise to be made, and your killer is dead like Jigsaw or Jason Voorhees, then come hell or high water, they will find a way to bring him back to life. Why? Because money talks and bullshit walks. So now we gotta go into the final entry of this franchise for now, because I don't know if they're gonna make any more movies, and that is the movie simply known as Victor Crowley, aka Hatchet 4. And we'll start off with Perry Shen as Andrew. Now, he was the quote-unquote sole survivor from Hatchet 3. In this movie, he wrote a book, but was accused of being the killer at one point. Go figure. And he is still being called murderer in the movie. Now, we learned in this movie that he was in a glam metal band called Haddonfield. And that was a very, very nice nod to the Halloween franchise. And for those who don't know, the Halloween movies take place in Haddonfield, Illinois. But I figure the vast majority of you listening to this probably know that, but there's always those one or two that is going to go, "What's the importance of Haddonfield? It's just a random name." Then we move on to Laura Ortiz as Rose. Now, she's a makeup artist who's making a B-movie slasher that's based on Victor Crowley in this movie. And there's nothing really more to this character other than she brings Victor Crowley back to life. And I'll get into that in a minute. Then we have Brian Quinn as Austin. And I'm only bringing up this character because it's Brian Quinn. And most of you might know him from the show Impractical Jokers. He plays a sound guy that's working with the talk show host that happens to be Andrew's ex-wife. And finally, we have Kane Hodder as Victor Crowley, and there's nothing that's added to his character in this movie. He just shows up just to kill more people. Now, Victor Crowley narratively takes place 10 years after the events of Hatchet 3. Andrew has moved on to write a book about the Honey Island Swamp massacres, and during the press tour, he gets an offer to fly back to where the massacres happened, and is told that he will be making $1 million. The plane crashes in the swamp, and Victor Crowley comes for them all again. Now, how does Victor Crowley come back to life? Because that's always the secret, because we saw him die in Hatchet 3. Well, in this movie, there's 3 people wanting to make a mock trailer for a B-movie slasher film based on Victor Crowley. The director of that wants the makeup artist to say the voodoo curse that made Victor Crowley who he was in the first place, so she goes to YouTube, of all places, to learn how to say the phrase. The phone phrase gets repeated enough times to where Victor Crowley is now reborn and is a full-blown killing machine again. So just think, it's like saying Beetlejuice 3 times, and he magically reappears. Now, before that happens, Honey Island Swamp has turned itself into a tourist attraction now, complete with Victor Crowley merchandise, run amok. Now, this doesn't surprise me in the world of the movie. I just thought that it was interesting, and now the state of Louisiana has to close the swamp again because Victor Crowley has now come back from the dead. Oopsie. And the kills in this movie aren't really as memorable as they were in the first 2. Victor Crowley does bust out his belt sander, but he doesn't use it to kill anyone in the movie. He just uses it to saw his way through the plane. Oh yeah, the vast majority of the characters just stay in the crashed plane the entire time. They're not even running around the swamp trying to get away from the guy most of the time. And it's really sad knowing that my favorite weapon other than his hatchet is that gas-powered belt sander, and he doesn't use it to fuck some bitches up. Now, the movie ends with Andrew and Rose being the only survivors of the night. Now, during a mid-credits scene, because mid-credits scenes are a thing, thanks Marvel, it's revealed that Mary Beth is still alive. Yes, the chick that ended the Victor Crowley curse that got impaled on a tree through her liver still lives. All she does after seeing the news report is run over, grab the shotgun, and yell, "I've been waiting for you, motherfucker!" Now, my primary gripe with this movie is that it really feels pointless. Hatchet 1 and 2 were great. Hatchet 3, while far from perfect, at least ended the story of Victor Crowley. There was no real reason to go back and make a Hatchet 4. Just like I said not that long ago, if there's enough money to be made with a horror franchise, they'll bring the killer back to life come hell or high water. In the Saw movies, the Jigsaw Killer died in Saw 3, but he was brought back in every movie throughout the franchise through the use of flashbacks. In Friday the 13th, Jason was revived, 3 times? He was killed in part 4, brought back to life in part 6, got killed in part 6, was brought back to life in part 7, and then he was transformed back into the 10-year-old boy before he drowned in part 8. Then he was brought back to life again for Jason Goes to Hell, and then dies again in Jason X as he's being pushed into the atmosphere of that one planet. So, yeah, the problems with this movie are the same problems with the Friday the 13th franchise. At some point, the killer just has to die. But the studio or the filmmakers don't want to do that because the movies are making too much money. What's next? Are we going to see Hatchet 19, the best Hatchet sequel this year? Now, how was this movie series received? This movie series on Rotten Tomatoes, the highest score that a movie got was Victor Crowley, unfortunately, at 67%, and the lowest score goes to Hatchet 2 at 40%. And if we take an average of all the Rotten Tomatoes scores for each movie, we get a series average of 54.75%. And that's not a terrible score for a horror franchise. Now, on Metacritic, I could only find the scores of the first 3 movies and not the 4th one at the time I'm recording this episode. If you find the Metacritic score for Victor Crowley, please leave it in the comments because I am curious to know what it is because I cannot find it for the life of me. So let's still take a look at the average that we get just for the first 3 movies because the first 3 movies are all that fucking matter. The highest score goes to the first movie with the 57, and the lowest goes to the third movie with the 25. Now, the second movie had a score of 49. So if we take the average of all 3 scores, That's an average Metacritic score of around 43.666. I couldn't just say 2/3, I had to go 666. The number of the beast. And on IMDb, all of these movies have a score of either 5.7 out of 10 or 5.5 out of 10. So the average IMDb score would actually be a 5.6. It would be directly in between for the entire Hatchet series on IMDb. Again, not a terrible score for a horror franchise. Now, I did find the reported budgets for most of the movies. The only one I couldn't find was Hatchet 3. The first movie had a reported budget of $1.5 million. The second movie had $800,000, and Victor Crowley, aka Hatchet 4, had only $165,000. Now, I would assume that Hatchet 3 had a budget anywhere between $165,000 and $800,000 if I'm just roughly guesstimating, seeing how the budgets were getting smaller and smaller with each entry in this franchise. Now, the Hatchet series is a good set of slasher movies, and I stand by my statement on Hatchet 4, also known as Victor Crowley, that it was a pointless sequel. The story of Victor Crowley definitively ended with Hatchet 3 along with Mary Beth's. I loved Hatchet 1 and 2, and liked 3 despite that entry being far from perfect. I personally thought that Hatchet was a completely different beast before seeing the fourth movie, and before doing this retrospective, I had actually never seen the fourth movie, and I'll end the episode off with this. The big positive about this series is the movies aren't terribly long. All of the movies range anywhere from 80 to 83 minutes in runtime, so the movies don't overstay their welcome. Now let me get back to my comment on thinking that this series was a different beast. Let's look at the Friday the 13th franchise. That series, if we omit Freddy vs. Jason, has a total of 11 entries, with Jason getting killed and being revived at least 3 times. And the more I think about it, I think it's 5 times actually. Now look at the Halloween franchise. That franchise has a total of 11 movies in that franchise and 4 different timelines. Now, I really felt that Adam Green was done with Hatchet after Hatchet 3. It's time to put that series to bed and move on. But he had to come back and do a 4th movie and bring Victor Crowley back to life. What's next? Are we going to see 11 entries into this franchise? Oh, fuck it, might as well go for 15, really break the record. Now, what has been a plague to horror franchises is just the sequel after sequel after sequel. Friday the 13th and Halloween having 11 entries. Hellraiser had 10 entries, most of them were garbage. Saw has 8 entries, and I actually like most of the entries in the Saw franchise, so that's definitely the exception for me. And the Child's Play and Chucky movies have 7 movies, and an unofficial reboot that just came out, back in 2019? Now, I know that I'm sounding negative here, but I genuinely like the Hatchet trilogy because I felt that it really bucked the trend of sequel, sequel, sequel. I'm more afraid of this franchise dying because there's just too many sequels, and that no one down the line is going to want to watch the first 3 movies at least, because they're all good, despite the fact that Hatchet 3 is far from perfect, because now everybody looking at this in the future is going to go, oh, there's 12 movies in this series? Yeah, I think I'm going to pass on this one. And that's going to be really unfortunate because Adam Green really captured lightning in a bottle with that first movie and carried it over into the second movie, which is extremely rare for sequels. And Hatchet 3, I've stated multiple times, but I'll state it again, while far from perfect, at least ended the story of Victor Crowley. It at least closed the book. There was no reason for that 4th movie at all. And if I typically do not tell anyone what to watch, what to avoid, but I personally would avoid watching Victor Crowley, aka Hatchet 4, if I were you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio for today's Horror-thon episode, and sadly, the last one for 2020. I decided to really go out with a bang here, and I wanted to take a look at the John Carpenter classic Big Trouble in Little China. Now, this movie has been pegged as an action movie for years and years, and I feel that that really comes down to the fact that Kurt Russell was in this movie. Now, he did a lot of action movies in the 1980s, for those who don't know. Most of you listening probably know, but there's always those 1 or 2 that are like, what's the big deal about Kurt Russell? Isn't he the guy from the movie Miracle? Well, to get back to it, I do feel that this movie is more of a horror movie than an action movie at times, and we're going to explore that in this episode. Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, MetrObeliskradio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute, Library, or whatever platform you're currently watching this on or listening to it on. Now, with that out of the way, let's get right into Big Trouble in Little China. Now, as always, with all movie retrospectives, we always start off with the creative team. Now, this movie was directed by John Carpenter himself, and I feel this is a man that really needs no introduction if you're a fan of horror or science fiction. Now, for those of you who aren't, most obviously remember him as the creator of Michael Myers and the Halloween franchise. Yes, it started with him. And he's done other movies like Assault on Precinct 13, The Thing, the remake from 1982, They Live with Roddy Piper and Keith David, In the Mouth of Madness that starred Sam Neill, Escape from New York and Escape from LA that both starred Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken. Now, this man has cemented himself in the world of not just horror and science fiction, but that really of pop culture. Now let's move on and into the writers, and there's two writers for this movie. You've got Gary Goldman, and now he only has 7 writing credits to his name that include this movie. His other writing credits are the tie-in video game of the same name to this movie, Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen, Next with Nicolas Cage and Jessica Biel, that movie that followed, Magicians. And he is credited for the 2012 reboot of Total Recall, along with the announced reboot of this beloved movie that we are looking at today. And the next writer we're going to look at is David Z. Weinstein. Now, this would be the only movie that he would write. His other writing credits include the tie-in video game and the announced reboot of this beloved movie. Now, the two writers I just mentioned were first-time screenwriters at the time, but the movie was not written as a horror action movie. It was actually written as a Western that took place in the 1880s. 20th Century Fox hired another writer to come in and adapt the original screenplay into what we now know as Big Trouble in Little China, and that writer that they hired was W.D. Richter. Now, his writing credits include Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the remake that starred Donald Sutherland and Jeff Goldblum, Dracula with Frank Langella, Needful Things with Max von Sydow and Ed Harris, Home for the Holidays with Holly Hunter and a very, very young Robert Downey Jr., and the movie Stealth with Jessica Biel and Josh Lucas. Now let's move on to our character analysis portion of this, and we're going to start off with Kurt Russell as Jack Burden. Now, he's our main character for this movie. He's a truck driver that just happens to stumble into this ancient Chinese war and gets captured. After this, the man simply just wants his truck back. And that's it. Then we have Kim Cattrall as Gracie Law, and yes, that is how she's introduced in this movie. Oh, don't worry guys, it's just me, Gracie Law. Now, she's the lawyer, and at one point she gets captured because she has green eyes, and Lo Pan needs a woman with green eyes to break the curse. Then we have Dennis Dunn as Wang. He's the restaurant owner who is Jack's friend. He has a girl coming from China, and the girl gets kidnapped by Lo Pan's men. Then we have Victor Wong as Egg Shen. He's the guy that drives the tour bus, and he also deals in the Chinese magic. So he's needed primarily for that reason to confront Lo Pan, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And also, he's also the narrator for the story. Then we have Kate Burton as Margot. Now, she's the journalist who's accompanying Gracie, and there's really nothing more to her other than she's just along for the ride. And finally, we have James Hong as Lo Pan. Now, I would argue that he's actually the protagonist of this movie because his actions are actually moving the plot forward. Jack Burton's just getting in the way. Jack Burton just happens to stumble across everything. He's a guy who was cursed by the first Chinese emperor to live as a demon, unless if he can marry a girl with green eyes, not 3 eyes, that would be weird, green eyes, and then sacrifice her so that he would become flesh again, and basically he becomes human once more. Now, this movie starts out as normal as you can start out. A truck driver rolls into town and just has a fun night. After that, he's owed money from his friend. He and his friend go to the airport to pick up a girl that's coming in. She gets kidnapped. They chase the kidnappers and stumble upon an ancient war in Chinatown. At one point, the truck driver loses his truck, and that's all he wants to get back is just his truck. Now, if we look at the Jack Burton character, the truck driver, he is a man with no name character. He's the guy who strolls into town, solves the problem, and leaves. No backstory other than he's the stranger who just rolled into town one day. Now, I put this episode under Horror-thon and for a simple reason. I feel that this movie is more of a horror movie with action elements rather than an action movie with horror elements. Jack Burton is not an action hero by any stretch of the imagination. He's just a truck driver. Yes, he carries a knife, but he's never fired a gun before. Now, how do I know this? Because at one point in the movie, when he tries to fire the machine pistol, he doesn't realize that the safety is on, and even when he disengages the safety, he accidentally fires off a few shots before he hits the first guy. Now, that doesn't sound like an action hero, and John Carpenter went out of his way to show that Jack Burton is not, this gun-wielding action hero just in that one moment. And that really goes for every other character in this movie. You have a truck driver, a lawyer, a journalist, a restaurant owner, and an old magic man going and fighting a supernatural threat. Yes, these people are literally fighting demons in the movie. There are creatures in the sewers below Chinatown. At one point, Gracie gets captured by a demon-like creature after going through a door that magically opened when she walked right on by. Ooh, I wonder what's in there. Yoink! Also, the first big scare in the movie comes after the elevator that Jack and Wang are in gets flooded, and they have to swim by all the dead bodies that are chained to the bottom of that water. Now, there's other moments that are clearly meant to be more horror. At one point, Wang says that the area is clear just to have the guy randomly jump out of nowhere and just start fighting with him. Now, I'll end this section off with this because I don't want to bore you to death. I said that this movie starts out normal. Just a truck driver who strolls into town, but then gets caught up in a kidnapping of a girl that leads to some ancient Chinese war with a guy that wants to break a curse by marrying a woman with green eyes just to kill her, so he returns to normal human, no longer demon, just because the truck driver wanted to make sure that the guy who owed him the money didn't skip town by going to the airport. None of the characters in this movie are action heroes, as I stated. The only one who could take on Lo Pan was Egg Shen, and even then, he couldn't fight Lo Pan on his own. His magic wasn't strong enough to beat Lo Pan, and it is shown by the end of the movie. Now, Lo Pan dies by Jack catching his knife and immediately throwing it back and hitting Lo Pan right square in the third eye. So now let's look at how this movie has been received overall. This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 77% based on 44 critic reviews and an audience score of 82% based on 136,431 audience reviews. Now, this movie has a Metacritic score of 53 based on 14 critic reviews and a user score of 8.1 out of 10 based on 44 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 7.3 out of 10, and that's based on 120,654 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $25 million back in 1986, so if we adjust that for inflation and 2020 numbers, that's a budget of $59,101,505.47. Yes, this is on the higher end of a mid-budget movie that's being made today. And the movie only grossed $11,100,374 during its initial theatrical run. Yes, at the time, this movie not only did poorly commercially, but critically as well. Roger Ebert said about the movie, quote, "Special effects don't mean much unless we care about the characters who are surrounded by them." David Anson of Newsweek wrote, quote, "Though it is action-packed, spectacularly edited, and often quite funny, one can't help feeling that Carpenter is squeezing the last drops out of a fatigued genre." And David Robinson wrote for the British newspaper The Times that he felt that John Carpenter was, quote, "overwhelmed by his own special effects without a strong enough script to guide him." Now, this movie doing so poorly critically and commercially at the time made John Carpenter swear off the Hollywood studio system entirely. After this, he would only do independent films, and John Carpenter said in an interview, quote, "The experience of Big Trouble was the reason I stopped making movies for the Hollywood studios. I won't work for them again. I think Big Trouble is a wonderful film, and I am very proud of it. But the reception it received and the reasons for that reception were too much for me to deal with. I'm too old for that sort of bullshit." Even though this movie was not beloved at the time, it has gone on to be a cult classic, an underrated gem, if you will. This movie even made AFI's top 500 films list at one point, somewhere in the 400s. I don't remember where exactly it was on that list. A lot of beloved classics from the 80s got this same treatment. The most famous examples of this are Blade Runner and Flash Gordon, the movie with Sam Jones. And I'll end the episode off with this. I enjoy the movie for what it is. It's just a fun action horror movie that you can pop on if you're not in the mood to watch something else a little more serious. But here's where my criticisms come out. I feel that there are spots in this movie where it wants to be an action movie and then immediately after it wants to be a horror movie. I feel that this movie does have a bit of an identity crisis as compared to John Carpenter's other movies like Halloween, The Thing, and They Live. I'm not saying that this movie is automatically bad for having an identity crisis. There are some good things that happen in this movie, and I'll even go as far as to say this. It's next to impossible to be bored watching this movie. But if I personally have the choice between watching this movie again or watching They Live again, I would pick They Live before I would pick Big Trouble in Little China. Now that mostly comes down to personal preference for me, because I actually didn't watch Big Trouble in Little China for the first time until I was 20. And that was just a few years ago. By the time I watched Big Trouble in Little China, I had already seen the movies They Live, The Thing, In the Mouth of Madness, and Escape from New York. Also Escape from LA. If Big Trouble in Little China had been my first or second John Carpenter movie that I had ever seen, then I would probably have more nostalgia for it. But again, this is not a bad movie. It's a fun movie that is that you will not get bored watching.